Welcome to Back to the Father, a show about the journey of life focused on our final end, which is God Himself, our loving Father. And now, here's your host, Dave Palmer.
And welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of Back to the Father. It's a production of the Guadalupe Radio Network. We're in our North Texas studio. It is May 26, 2023. And we are glad that you are here with us. This is an interactive show. We appreciate your comments. You can call in if you'd like, especially during the third segment where we just leave it wide open for those of us in studio and also you, whether you're in social media or just want to call in to let us know what you think about the topic. So phone number is 877-757-9424. And again, if you're watching us on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, feel free to comment and Sissel will read your comments. And we do appreciate interaction because the more of that we get, the better the program is. This is a program where we focus on the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, as is taught in his Summa Theologia that he wrote back in the 13th century when he lived. And, I have, ever since I started reading the Summa, I have become convinced that the high point of philosophical thought happened in the scholastic age, where Thomas and others were able to take what was good from the classical age of the Greek philosophers and then Christianize it in a sense and incorporate it into Catholic theology rather than Catholic theology into pagan philosophy and come up with a really, really good system of philosophy. And for the last 500 or 600 years, that has just been picked apart little by little, starting with Occam and Descartes and going through all these other philosophers. So we always spend one segment talking about a philosopher other than Aquinas and whether for good or for bad, what impact that philosopher has had. Today we got a doozy. I'm going to talk to you about a philosopher you may or may not have ever heard of, but I promise you, feel the effects of this philosopher on our culture today because it is absolutely profound and it's really bad, okay? His name is Jacques Derrida, and I'll tell you more about him in the second segment. In fact, I'll tell you a little bit more about him right now. I do want to introduce in studio, the only person in studio with me right now is Sissel Anderson, so she has got the weight of the philosophical world on her shoulders. Sissel, no pressure, okay?
I think I might just go out now. I also like how you didn't leave any spoilers. You were just like, it's bad. His philosophy's bad.
In fact, a lot of these philosophers, you remember when we talked about Nietzsche, there's a lot about Nietzsche that I like,
right.
He was an atheist and there's more bad than good.
Sure.
But his zeal for life, his, this whole idea of the Superman and, he's almost like a motivational speaker,
sure.
but strictly on the temporal level. With Jacques Derrida, I don't know that I can see a lot of good in him. I mean, there's always something. I mean, the fact that a lot of people were attracted to his philosophy, there's something good. That's a clear Thomistic principle. In fact, leads me perfectly into our first topic, which is God's goodness that we'll be talking about today as well. But Sissel is also, we're celebrating her birthday today because Monday, on Memorial Day, she turns... Am I allowed to say the number?
Yeah, you're allowed
25
to say the number.
years old.
Woo-woo.
And so she's a great blessing to our office here, and so we appreciate her very much. So thank you for being you, Sissel.
You're welcome. I had very little to do with me being here, but here I am.
You don't have much of a choice, do you?
Did not.
All right. So again, I don't want to badger you, but please don't be bashful out there. Let us know what you think. I'm especially interested in your thoughts on Jacques Derrida. Like right now, have you ever heard of the guy? Okay, has that name ever crossed your radar? It definitely has in the effects of his philosophy, but I'm just curious as to whether you have ever heard of him. So first slide here shows, the kind of become the slogan of the show. You think, therefore you're a philosopher. And one thing that I guess, if I were to stand on my bully pulpit or whatever, and just make a point to the world, is that we have to pay attention to philosophy. Okay, we don't all have to get into it perhaps as much as I do, or other people that are really obsessed with it. But we have to know the basics because philosophy is completely influencing our life. And also, you can't really do theology unless you know philosophy. I've said it many times. seminarians learn philosophy and then theology, okay? Philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. It's not as important, but it's a stepping stone to learn how to think in order that the supernatural realities that we learn in theology are more easily able to be understood. Okay, all right, that's my lecture. Okay, I'll get off that. All right, so here we go. Segment number 1 today. We're going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas' teaching on the goodness of God and also goodness in general. Now, this is review. I don't know if you remember this lesson or not, Sissel. I won't put you on the spot. But if, as we go through this, you say, I think I've learned this before, that's a good sign. Okay, that means your young, agile, 25-year-old brain is acting properly.
Isn't it like 25 when your brain fully develops? I should
right?
be at peak year. I'm not 25 yet, though. I'm still a couple days shy. So if anything that I don't remember, we'll blame it on that.
You're still on the ascend.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. I think that's probably about right. What does that say for about a 56-year-old guy?
I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah,
they really stopped talking about it after that.
Yeah, they just your brain is pretty much mush. All right, segment number 2, as I talked about, 20th century French philosopher Jacques Derrida and Deconstructionism. I'm going to ask you in a moment, when you hear the word Deconstructionism, what's the first image or word that comes to your mind? Okay, don't answer now. Okay, segment number 3, we're going to talk about all that we've talked about. And that's especially when we want to get your phone calls and also your comments on social media. But feel free to comment throughout the
Anytime,
show.
Yeah.
Sissel has an eagle eye on it.
Speaking of, Buddy says that he's heard of deconstructionism, but not the man who created it, kind of behind it. And I think that would be similar to my understanding, because I had not heard the name Jacques Derrida. Is that how you say it? Derrida,
yeah, exactly.
Derrida.
Some people say Derrida, but I think it's Derrida.
I like Derrida because it sounds a little bit like Dorito. Sorry, that's terrible.
All right.
And Monica Cortez also says no, first time she's hearing about it as well. So,
well, please stay tuned. I beg you to do that. We won't hold it against you if you have to go and pick up the kids at school or something.
We won't tell which one of you left anyway. So
Monica just left, Dave.
We don't get a notification every time.
Okay. Do you have the timeline up here? These are the philosophers that we have talked about specifically. I have them in a timeline. It's important to know who came when in the history of philosophy, because they influence each other so much. Okay, so I kind of ran out of room on my linear line here, but you can see that Occam came right after Aquinas, and then Pascal, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche. These are all the ones that we've dedicated entire segments of the show. And then Jacques Derrida. He was alive 20 years ago.
I actually was alive for part of the time that he was alive.
Yes.
And that's wild. That's the first time that's happened, I feel like, with philosophers we've been talking about.
And he also, and I think this is kind of an unusual thing, he was kind of like a celebrity philosopher. Oh. You can see he's a pretty dapper looking guy. Sure. And he dressed very nicely, and he always had his trench coat on and his tie, and the women loved him, and he was alleged to have had a lot of ladies in his life. Let's just say that. But he is the father of deconstructionism, okay? And I know this is not the segment where we're going to talk about him specifically, but let me just say one more thing. The image that comes to your mind, and if you're out there watching on social media, please let us know, because I got one that I mentioned on Adrian's show this morning that I saw at the beginning of a video that I think symbolizes what Derrida is all about. Does anything come to your mind when you think of deconstructionism? What does that word just mean?
I don't know. In my opinion, I just think about taking apart all of the I don't know, maybe the moral standards, the moral that kind of thing, the structure of society. I feel like just taking that all apart. That's kind of what I picture.
Oh, great! Have you seen yet on the PowerPoint the image that I'm about to show?
I have not.
Because look at this. Here it is. It's a wrecking ball.
Oh,
okay.
Shoot.
That is the image that I think of. Let's say for example, you're driving down the freeway and you see a building. Okay, I remember when this happened here in North Texas to the old Texas Stadium where the Cowboys play.
Yeah.
At one point, they decided to destroy it, okay? So they probably did dynamite instead of a wrecking ball, but they just, let's just assume they do a wrecking ball. Well, you assume a couple of things. Well, whatever that structure is, it's being destroyed for a reason. It's no longer needed, and they want to build something else. That's exactly what Jacques Derrida did. Is he said, in essence, the structure of Western philosophical thought, the structure of tradition, the structure, of Aristotle and the scholastics and everything that we've been taught, it just needs to be destroyed. And we're going to do it through language. Okay, Derrida did have a Marxist past, some sympathies towards Marxism. I think it was so unpopular in the 80s and 90s when he was living that I don't know that he talked about it a lot. But anyways, it's kind of like literary Marxism, let's just say. But all right, so that's what we're going to be getting into now. But in this first segment, I want to talk about the goodness of God, because it's a real contrast between Aquinas's teaching on goodness of God and what we're going to learn about in the second segment with Jacques Derrida and Deconstructionism, okay? Because I would dare say that he is destroying goodness itself. He's trying to, he's not going to ever succeed. Reality itself, realism. Remember we talked about Occam and realism versus nominalism? It definitely is related to this, okay? So, so I did something interesting, Sissel. Okay. I went on Canva, where you can get those images. Yeah. And I put in the word goodness, and I said go. And what I'm about to show you are the first 4 images that popped up, okay? I did not editorialize. Here they are right there. When I put in goodness into Canva, which is a site where you can make graphics and things like that, this is what they at least
I appreciate
suggest.
The food being there. I very much respect
And you
that.
can see how it's kind of healthy food.
Yes.
So they're saying the goodness of food. And I presume the top left is just,
helping each other out.
A couple people
friends.
having fun.
Yeah.
They look like they're very nice people. The one on the top right, I don't know what's happening there. She's not even smiling, but there's something kind of magical or mystical going on with this little girl. And so that's, it's a little ethereal. And then, friendly lady, with a smile on her face. And so we all kind of know what goodness is. I mean, how would you define goodness? It's, without using the word good.
I was going to say, it's good, man.
Yeah, I mean, Aquinas would say that which all desire, it's, something's good when we desire something, it's because of its goodness. Yeah. We just had cake and pizza, and good. The reason why everybody was enjoying it is because it's good. There's something about it that does our body right, huh? So we're going to talk about something interesting that happens in the Summa. You might remember this. We talked about this a while back. But Aquinas, in question number 3 of the Summa, starts talking about the attributes of God. And in question 3, he says the first attribute is his simplicity. Okay, God is simple, perfectly simple, which is really interesting, but it's kind of complicated. All right, and then he goes on in the next question, question number 4, he says God is perfect. Okay, God. So the second attribute is, in question number 4, God is perfect. God is perfection, I should say. Okay, and then in question number 5, instead of saying God is good, he says, let's talk about goodness in general. Okay, let's not go right into God being good. Do you remember, not to put you on the spot, do you remember why he does this? There's a very, very specific reason, and don't worry if you don't. And anybody out there in social media land, why would Aquinas, before saying God is good, God is goodness, say, let's just tap the brakes here for a second and talk about goodness in general? Okay.
I mean, it just makes sense before you call somebody something, that everyone should understand what we mean by that word. Yeah. I think it makes logical sense if you're writing something. You got to define your terms, because you could say like, God is, breathtakingly fabulous, and maybe be like, well, what does that mean? What do you mean by that? I don't know what that means.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, but I think even in addition to that, and that's a very good point, what he's going to say is, well, we can't like directly experience God in this life. And so for you to say, I think to your point, Cecil, you got to kind of define what it is. So Thomas is saying, okay, well, let's use examples in our everyday life of what's good, and that's going to help us understand God's goodness. Because otherwise, it's just abstract. It's just out there. It's just a word, God is good. So Thomas is going to ask a couple of things here. He says in question number 5, Article 1, whether goodness differs really from being. Okay, so, and he says goodness and being are really the same. and differ only in idea, which is clear from the following argument. The essence of goodness consists in this, that it is in some way desirable, as I mentioned, and hence the philosopher Aristotle says, goodness is what all desire. Okay, and then he doubles down here, because you're thinking like, gosh, I don't think tornadoes are good. I don't think scorpions are good. I don't think, rattlesnakes are good, but they have being, right? I don't think, you can think of a lot of things that have being that aren't good. Then he says, is every being good? Okay, then he says, every being that is not God is God's creature. Now, every creature of God is good, and God is the greatest good. Therefore, every being is good. So I've shown this picture before, the mosquito, the scorpion, the rattlesnake. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, these are good creatures, okay? They have being, they exist, they were created by God. God doesn't make any mistakes, they're good, okay? So I wanted everybody to say 4 times, scorpions are good, okay? Do you like scorpions?
I mean, I've not encountered one in the wild. I probably would not like it that much.
You've never seen a scorpion
No,
in the
I've seen
wild?
encounters, but like I've seen them, but usually not in the wild. Thankfully, I've not run into one. I've only ever seen them like in pictures in zoos and things like that. So,
I've caught many scorpions.
Have
in
you
my
really?
life. Yeah, we used to catch them all the time.
I'm okay that I haven't.
Yeah, I've never been stung by one, thanks to the guys. So, all right. So then this is interestingly when Adrian was interviewing me this morning on Catholic Drive Time. This is the article that he kind of honed in on, because he said, Dave, explain what it means that goodness has the aspect of a final cause. And I hope I answered it intelligently on Catholic Drive Time this morning, with my first cup of coffee at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Before cake.
Before cake. So Thomas says, yes, goodness has the aspect of a final cause. But in order to understand final cause, you have to understand Aristotle's 4 causes, which are efficient cause, formal cause, material cause, and final cause. We won't go over all of them, but final cause has to do with purpose. It has to do with meaning, okay? So when we are drawn to something, okay, it is there is purpose in it. There's a meaning. There's a reason why we're drawn to it, okay? So a final cause is what moves us, okay? That cake moved us to action, didn't it?
It really moved me to want to take a nap, but yes.
And then you had to do this darn show.
Then I had to come on here.
Yeah. So goodness moves us to action. Okay. The only reason we are moved towards something is because it's good. Okay. So that means the goodness has an aspect of a final cause because it draws us to itself. Okay. So Thomas says, since goodness is that which all things desire, and since this has the aspect of an end, it is clear that goodness implies the aspect of an end. Nevertheless, the idea of goodness presupposes the idea of an efficient cause and also of a formal cause. So he just mentioned 3 of the 4 causes in that one sentence there, and so it's kind of deep, it's kind of complicated, but the thing that draws us to itself in some ways begins emotion. Okay, because so you say like, I saw the cake, I walked to the cake, I ate the cake. But in a sense, the cake's attractiveness is what began the whole cycle, right? So the final cause, the purpose of what you did was in the goodness of the cake. Okay, that's kind of deep philosophy, right?
It's a lot there
can
about cake.
Can I have another piece of cake?
I was going to say, I need more cake for this to go down right.
Okay, so these are the images that Canva brought up. These all represent goodness in some way, and these all ultimately draw us to our final end, which is God himself. Okay, so if there's, I mentioned, I know you're not probably listening at 7 o'clock in the morning, but I was mentioning about how in the car driving my son to school in the morning, I will invariably say to him, Patrick, do you see anything out in the world that's good? And lately he's been saying tree. He sees trees. And I said, yes. I said, what's good about a tree? And, I've kind of trained him to say, gives us air, it gives us wood for the fire, it gives us shade, it's very, very beautiful. There's a lot of good things about trees, right? And how does a tree stay alive? By getting water. Where does the water come from? Clouds. Who produces the water? God. And so you begin to see kind of a teleological or purpose-driven type of system of goodness, all being directed by the efficient cause, who's God, and all these other final causes which give purpose to things. Okay, so, and if I might just say, I think what modern philosophy has done is it's taken that, what I'd call enchantment, out of the human experience. Most of us, myself included, up until really recently when I started studying Aquinas, I didn't even notice. I didn't notice much about the created world. I think in the scholastic age, people noticed more. They were watching the stars. They were watching and curious about the solar system. They were curious about the cycles of life and the animals and the creatures and the human person. And then starting with Descartes in the modern philosophy, the emphasis was more, we need to control this. Okay, we need to impose ourselves upon this and study it and figure it out, like in a academic setting, rather than allow ourselves to be enchanted by it and to learn from it and ultimately draw closer to God from it. Okay, so last thing here, question number 6. After goodness in general, is God good? How do you think Thomas is going to answer this one? Is God good? What do you take a wild guess?
Let me think about it. I'm going to say...
Just go with your gut.
Yes.
All right. He says, to be good belongs preeminently to God. For a thing is good according to its desirableness. Now everything seeks after its own perfection, and the perfection and form of an effect consist in a certain likeness to the agent. Oh, gosh, that's like reading Shakespeare there. That is so beautiful. Since every agent makes its like, and hence the agent itself is desirable and has the nature of good. For the very thing which is desirable in it is the participation of its likeness. Go ahead and grab a Kleenex if you're getting emotional. Therefore, since God is the first effective cause of all things, it is manifest that the aspect of good and of desirableness belong to him, and hence Dionysius attributes good to God as to the first efficient cause, saying that God is called good as by whom all things subsist. All goodness comes from God because God is the efficient cause. So all the goodness that we experience in the world tells us something about God. It leads us to God, and therefore it makes more sense for Aquinas to first talk about the goodness that we can more easily experience, like hot fudge sundaes and banana splits and pizza and the love of a friend and the sunset. And then once we say, oh, these things are good, and then he hits you with a whammy and says, and they're all there because of God, and they all lead you to God. They tell you something about God. And that's what's enchantment. That is looking at the world and not just seeing birds and clouds and trees, but seeing the effects of God. Okay, not seeing God, that's pantheism. Don't be a heretic, but seeing the effects of God in the created world. Okay? So that's the fun part of the show. Now we go on to deconstructionism next. Aren't you excited?
So excited. Real quick before we move on, I have a question, if you don't mind, real quick.
Yeah.
Mary was asking, because when you're talking about that, when we see something like we're talking about the cake and I was attracted to it, you want it, she goes, wouldn't some call that temptation? Like, when does it border from like being drawn to something because it's good and temptation?
Great question. Thank you, Mary. All right, so before original sin, there would not have been any temptation. All right, Adam and Eve would have had no temptation to eat too much. The temptation that you talk about is called concupiscence, and that is an effect of original sin, and that is the human condition right now where we are wounded. And we are wounded because of original sin, and that's why we need the virtues. That's why we need temperance. That's an acquired virtue, right? And that's why we need fortitude, and we need justice, and we need prudence, and we need knowledge and the intellectual virtues and the theological virtues. Those are what are helping us in our wounded condition to get to our final end. But it wouldn't have been the case had Adam and Eve not sinned. Thank you, Adam and Eve, for messing everything up for us, right? All right. Thanks, Mary. Great question. So let's take a break. And I jokingly say this deconstructionism is a downer, and it's a really weird philosophy. So I'll tell you about Jacques Derrida and deconstructionism right after this. You need to know about this. I'm telling you, because if you're upset about critical race theory, if all the LGBT stuff, if all the, the pitting man against woman and, black against white and, rich against poor, if you get tired of all that nonsense, Derrida is a big reason why we have it. Okay, so that's a little clue. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. This is Back to the Father. Thanks for joining us. It's a production of the Guadalupe Radio Network. We're broadcasting on all of the social media sites of YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. And we also can take calls. If you'd like to call in and ask a question audibly, especially during the third segment, we really appreciate that. The phone number is 877-757-9424. 877-757-9424. Okay, I've got a graphic up now that shows Jacques Derrida in the middle, born in 1930 and died in 2004, just 19 years ago. So he is very much a modern philosopher. In fact, this age of philosophy, you know what they call it? They call it postmodern, which is really, it almost is like an oxymoron. That's such how can you be postmodern? But we're in the postmodern phase. And those other philosophers that I have up on the page with him, I put those up there because to understand Derrida, as much as Derrida is able to be understood, you have to understand a lot of other philosophers as a prerequisite if you're able. The first one on the top left is Plato. And of course, Plato believed in universal forms. He believed there was something real about the things that we see in the world. You know, there's real treeness, there's real catness, but he thought it was in a different realm. He thought it was in a realm of universal forms, right? On the bottom left, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was hugely influential on Derrida, and Nietzsche lived 100 or so years before Derrida, and he was an existentialist, atheist philosopher who basically believed that we had to destroy the old system of Christianity and usher in a new age of philosophy, a new kind of recreation of the entire moral system. Okay, that's why he said God is dead. He said God is dead and we killed him. And Nietzsche was like, oh my goodness, okay, if God is dead and our Christian framework is gone, what are we going to fill the vacuum with? What's next? He was actually kind of panicking. Okay, because he really believed that there was no such thing as God, but what are we going to do in a world without God? We got to make up a moral system, all right? And in that regard, it actually showed that, without God, there's a vacuum. Top right is Thomas Aquinas, our hero, and the purpose that we do this show. Bottom right is William of Ockham. And if you remember that you got that one.
Occam's razor.
Occam's razor, and he also was the man that popularized nominalism, that instead of reality being in things, it's just a name that we give to them, okay? And, oh my goodness, so much damage done by nominalism. And you're going to see the wicked, bitter fruits of nominalism in Jacques Derrida. Okay, so you ready? And next slide, as we get to know Derrida. And I told Sissel before we started, I said, I'm very curious how much of this makes sense. How much of this do you kind of get the connection to what's going on in the world today? I'm going to do my best to explain it. I've got, I think, 3 or 4 slides. I'm going to throw some stuff out at you and just let me know how much this makes sense, okay? So Derrida was a 20th century and, of course, into the 21st century, Algerian-born French philosopher. Now, this is key. He suffered persecution as a child because he was Jewish at a time of anti-Semitism, primarily in Algeria, where it was mostly Muslims. And so you imagine in that age living as a minority Jew in a Muslim country. So he knew firsthand bigotry and exclusion. And I think that plays into, I think you got to look into the personal lives of these people because it really plays a big part. So he developed a philosophy called Deconstructionism. And he is considered a post-structurist and a post-modern skepticist. Okay, so he had skepticism. Okay, and you'll see what that means as we go through this. Okay, he cast doubts on the foundation of the modern intellectual worldview, and he focused on the meaning of language and the written word. I mentioned that at one point in his life he expressed some Marxist sympathies, but it was a time when being outright Marxist. You imagine the age of Ronald Reagan in the 80s, where communism was falling, and the wall, the Berlin Wall was being knocked down, and so Marxism was not very popular. More nowadays, unfortunately, it's more popular. Okay, so I think what Derrida did was said, okay, I can express these kind of views through literary criticism of language, criticism of words. Okay, but most recently in the last 150 years, philosophy has taken what's called the linguistic turn, where there's been a hyper-focus attention on language, the words we use. But you can see that it goes all the way back to Occam. Occam lived 800 years ago. He was saying that things are just names that we assign to them. That's why Occam has had such a great influence on the philosophers today. Okay, now he had something called arca writing. And it refers to the way in which the writing is possible only on account, this is kind of deep, of the deferral of meaning that ensures that meaning can never be definitively present.
I'm sorry, the what now?
So what he basically is going to say is we can't figure out the meaning of terms. Okay, we can't, like even something as simple as cat or pig or dog, okay? Plato would say, okay, we see the pig, we see the cat, we see the dog. There's an ultimate ideal form of these things up in another realm, which is a little weird, but at least he believed in truth. He believed in realism. He believed these were real things, okay? Jacques Derrida wants to kind of punch a hole in that type of thinking. And he's going to say, no, it's much more nuanced than that. It's kind of confusing. I'll give some examples of what he's talking about, okay? His most famous books came out right around the time I was born, 1967. Speech and Phenomena of Grammatology is his most famous book, and then also Margins of Philosophy, okay? So, all right, next slide. I'm going to confuse you some more. Now, here's a little bit about deconstructionism, okay? His most famous quote is where he says, there is nothing outside the text. Sometimes it's interpreted as there is no outside text, okay? And I'll be honest with you, I have spent a lot of time the last week watching videos and reading about this quote, and I must admit I don't entirely know what it means other than some of the things that we're going to show right here. Okay, he fundamentally alters the way many academic fields are understood today. It's about dismantling our loyalty to any particular truth and understanding rather what lies buried in its opposite. Okay, so he was very, very concerned about binaries. Okay, man and woman. Okay, parent and child, teacher and student, black and white. He talked a lot about spoken word and written word. Okay, these binary terms, and what he tried to do is say the binaries are not as far apart as we think. And without you have the preferred term, and then you had the subordinate term. And he's saying, okay, the preferred term wouldn't even be possible if it wasn't for the subordinate term. And since it's only possible because you have the subordinate term, it's dependent on this one. And then he starts analyzing the bejeebers out of it to the point where your head is just spinning and you're like, I don't think there's any truth there at all. I don't even know what's going on anyways. But let me read some more. He believed that almost all of our thinking has with it a false and unjustified privilege of one thing over another. The neglected counterparts should be given more attention. Okay, so this is where you see this in our world today. Marxists say the rich lord over the poor, okay? The aristocracy over the lower class, right? This was Karl Marx's battle cry, right? That we need even the playing field. We need to really, really highlight the relationship between these two binaries. He deconstructed key binary terms such as male and female, reason and passion, words over picture, speech over writing. Okay, Derrida's claim that there is nothing outside the text means roughly that everything is interpretation. Interpretation is governed by context and the role of the interpretive community. So that means if there's a book in the corner of the room, rather than Sissel and I coming to some kind of agreement that it's a book, we want to know what's her interpretation of that? What's my interpretation of that? And what gets lost is any notion of truth, where maybe she's wrong, maybe I'm wrong. She thinks it's a caterpillar and I think it's a book, or vice versa. But it's interpretation. It's not that cut and dry. It's not like Plato's ideal forms where it's very, very concrete. No, it's much more nuanced than that, right? Derrida argues that there is no self-sufficient unit of meaning in a text because individual words or sentences in a text can only be properly understood in terms of how they fit into the larger structure of the text in language itself. Okay, so here's an example, Sissel. I want you to play along, okay? So don't look at the screen, okay? Look away.
I'm looking away.
So if I say the cat, okay,
Yep.
do you have an image in your mind?
Yep.
And then I add is sitting beside a man at a bar. Okay, so Derrida would say that first image you had of the cat was dependent on the other parts of that sentence because it changed the cat. Because you might have initially thought of this cat and maybe he was in a house on a couch, but no, he's not in a house on a couch. Now he's beside a man. Well, where's the man? The man's in the bar. So Derrida's saying you can't understand cat unless you understand all the other aspects of that cat and its circumstances. So therefore, we can't understand catness. Okay, so Plato's wrong.
Why is this guy making his life so much harder?
Okay, now look at this. The funny you asked that. He says
he's gonna make it harder.
No. He says the idea behind deconstruction. This is his quote. Is to deconstruct the workings of strong nation states with powerful immigration policies, to deconstruct the rhetoric of nationalism, the politics of place, the metaphysics of native lands and native tongues. He had a political agenda, okay? He, like I said, this was not just about language. He's trying to change the world, deconstruct power structures through language, okay? Okay, all institutions are held together by theory and language. Change interpretation of language, and you can change the world, okay? Think of what has happened with things like the word gay. There's a lot of things that used to mean one thing. They get twisted around, and then they mean something else. He also believed in something. He did not like logocentrism. He thought it was a naive devotion to reason, logic, or clear definition based on belief that language is the best way to communicate. Logocentrism, one of Derrida's concepts, has been defined as the illusion that the meaning of a word has its origin in the structure of reality and at the same time makes the truth part of that structure directly present to the mind. Okay, assumption that there can be some absolute truth that can be found through language. He rejected Platonic forms, as I mentioned. Words can't be pinned down to a single definite meaning. No truth of reality in words. Things only have meaning when compared to other things. So he says you can only understand a cat by comparing it to a dog or to a mouse or a monkey. A cat in and of itself is dependent on all the other terms, okay, which I don't know is absolutely true. Okay, one more thing, and then we'll take a break. take a little nap, and then we'll come back and discuss this, okay? And if you're out there watching and you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, this is pretty deep stuff, let me know your thoughts. Does any of this make sense? Okay, because like I said, it definitely is impacting the culture today. Okay, last things here. He wrote the book called Of Grammatology, okay, the scientific study of systems of writing. And he had this interesting word that he made up. And if you think of the word difference and take the E, like instead of D-I-F-F-E-R-E-N-C-E, it's D-I-F-F-E-R-A-N-C-E. Okay, and he made up a word called difference, but he spelled it differently. Okay, and the point he's trying to make is it's pronounced the same, but it means something different and it's spelled differently. And the only way that you can see that is by seeing the written word. You cannot do that through voice, okay, through the spoken language. Okay, so he didn't like logocentrism. The logos, okay, let me ask you this. Okay, you guys probably can tell this. Who are the two most famous people that pass down their teachings without ever writing anything down?
Socrates and Jesus.
Very good. Yes, very good. Okay.
I was really worried what kind of question you were going to go for.
Yeah,
I was like, please, do I know it?
Derrida thought that there was too much emphasis on the spoken word as opposed to the written word. And I can't help but think that this is because two of the men that he probably did not like at all never wrote down a word. It was passed down orally, and his whole thing with spoken versus written word, it's complicated. We're not going to get into all. We just don't have time for that. But he said language is very subjective and meaning differs from person to person. Therefore, it can't be a shared truth that we can all possess. He thought Western tradition of philosophy was based on binary oppositions where one term or concept is given primacy or privilege. Okay, male over female, white over black, speech over writing. And then he makes up this word. No, he didn't make it up, but he loved this word aporia, which means confusion, impasse, or puzzlement, which he wanted to give a positive spin to. Confusion and doubt, he said, are signs of a properly functioning, mature mind. So he loved the confusion. He wanted us to not be able to analyze text, not be able to give meaning to something, okay? Aristotle would be the exact opposite of Derrida, where Aristotle said that when we see something in the created world, we can actually attach meaning to it because we can abstract the form out of it. We can know what it is, okay? We can come to know something because that knowledge initially is in God. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the created world goes on to tell us something about God. All right, it's revealing something about God. Derrida would have absolutely rejected this, and he rejected it by basically saying there's no truth in anything. There's no objective truth, and everybody interprets things differently. We look at a text, and there's 1,000 different ways we can interpret it. It's just absolute confusion, okay? There's no certainty. And finally, an irresolvable internal contradiction or logical disjunction in a text, argument, or theory. Okay, that's another definition of aporia. So what does Derrida ultimately lead us with? Confusion, okay, ambiguity, puzzlement. All right, imagine trying to teach that to a child, trying to teach a child that the world ultimately is confusing. The world ultimately is just it's not, good and bad. It's not, there aren't male and female. There aren't, rich and poor. It all blends together. It's all based on interpretation. It's all based on power structure and privilege. Okay. This guy was a weird guy. Okay.
Really?
So that's Jacques Derrida to the best of my ability to explain him. And again, should you go and purchase Of Grammatology on Amazon tonight and spend your long Memorial Day weekend reading this? Well, God bless you if you do. You're probably going to have a headache by midnight tonight if you do that. Some people kind of have to read it, Some people get into it, but it's very confusing. And I would say purposely so, okay? Because, again, this is a guy that celebrated confusion. All right? So what do we have in our culture today? Disorder, confusion, chaos. Why? Because we've lost track of what it means to think properly, to think logically. And that is in large part due to the influence of what we call our postmodern and modern philosophers. So thanks, guys. Okay. All right. So that's that. Let's take a break and come back and get your thoughts. I'm hoping one person, just maybe one person, will call us up and talk to us audibly. I know Sissel has been taking just notes, but pages and pages of notes.
100%.
And she can give us her thoughts on it. Give us a call if you want to, 877-757-9424. Okay, 877-757-9424. What do you think of Jacques Derrida? Does it make sense at all? Do you see the connections between his philosophy and the mess that we're in the world today? Let's hear from you. We'll take a quick break and come back with the last segment right after this. All right, we are back. This is Back to the Father. It's a production of the Guadalupe Radio Network. We do this show every Friday at 1 o'clock Central on our Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter channels. And we do appreciate you hanging with us and learning about some of these oftentimes complicated topics of philosophy. Some of them are easier to understand than others, but some of them are more complicated. Some are famously complicated, like Immanuel Kant and Georg Hegel. These are very complicated philosophers to read, but any philosopher would say these guys have had tremendous, tremendous impact on our culture. So this is the part of the show. We've got a little bit more than 10 minutes to open it up to any of you who are out there watching. And if you would like to let us know what you're thinking about the goodness of God, the created goodness in general, or else the philosophy of Jacques Derrida, we are wide open right now. So let us know. And if you want to call, 877-757-9424, 877-757-9424. So any comments out there, Sissel?
Yeah, we got a couple to discuss. Mary on YouTube, earlier on when you were first starting to talk about Derrida, she was saying, especially when you're reading some of his quotes, she's like, he sounds like the father of the word salad.
Father of the word salad.
Father of the word salad, which means you throw a bunch of stuff together. And I'm saying a lot, but very little almost, just very confusing. And then also that confusion and doubt are of the evil one, which seems to be the things that he was, wanting really to be a part of our culture is confusion and doubt. And then also so that Jesus said, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. Again, Jesus is very clear and does not want confusion.
Was that Mary also? Very good. Yeah, Mary's got a good philosophical mind there.
Yeah, she also says that it sounds like he almost experienced like some sort of insanity or something. Like, I find it hard to believe that he would be able to live a stable life, with these kind of thoughts going through his head. It does seem
that's a good question. I mean, Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, the last 11 years of his life, he did go crazy, and he was just like a vegetable, and but you look at somebody like Aquinas, and there is no indication. I mean, I don't even know if I'd call it a crisis, but at the end of his life, he did have a vision of God, an ecstatic vision. And it was at that time that he decided that everything that he had written was like straw, and he no longer wrote again. And then a few months later, he was brought home to God, and he died. But I wouldn't necessarily call that a crisis. It was more of a ecstatic type of
Right. It was like the
thing.
opposite of a crisis.
Yeah, so it was a good thing. I personally wish he had finished the Summa. I wish he had just kind of hung in there a little bit longer and finished it, but that it wasn't my decision, obviously, to either.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Buddy said that Derrida, his philosophy is, Jacques Derrida philosophy is made mute because if every concept, idea, and belief is based on one's view and not a plume line, then deconstructionism is only based on his view, and someone else can very well say deconstructionism is something else.
Yeah,
kind of it unravels itself.
Yeah,
I think is what he's
right.
trying to say.
It's self negating. Yeah, the very concept of it. And Buddy, you're onto something. I know you said you had not really had much experience with this, but people have brought that up to him, that there are some self-refuting philosophies, and you have to be very careful. And someone like him, but you're absolutely right. And yeah, I don't know what his mental state was or what kind of a guy he was. Like I said, he lived. He was born in Algeria. He was French, but he taught in the final, I don't know, a couple decades of his life at University of California, Irvine, or it wasn't Berkeley. It was one of the schools out in California. He lived in America, and he was part of the Hollywood crowd, and he was quite popular in his day, and hung around the highfalutin social circles and that kind of thing. So I don't know. I mean,
wasn't Mother Teresa born in Algeria too?
Albania.
Oh my.
Yeah. She's
I was like, it's an owl country, wrong country. Never mind. I never said anything.
No, we'll edit that part out. Nobody saw that.
I'm not 25 yet, so I'm still not fully developed over here.
Yeah, that's right. Your brain is still developing.
I'm still developing over here. Yeah. It's interesting. You talked about his childhood and how much he experienced discrimination for being Jewish. I definitely think that probably had something to do with his philosophy, because maybe he just was trying to find the meaning of that. Like, why was that even? He goes, well, you can't understand it then. Yeah. Maybe that he was just searching for that.
And also, if you're looking at binaries, and I'm sure when he grew up, you're either a Muslim or a Jew in Algeria, or whatever. And that's a binary. You're this or that. And he found himself on not the privileged end of that, because the Muslims would have considered themselves privileged and the Jews were second-class citizens. He grew up during the time of World War II and the Nazi persecution. And so you could see where he would have sympathy for the subordinate side of a binary. And I mentioned on Adrian's show this morning that this whole talk about binaries, when I was in high school, that word, I bet you if you had asked everybody in my high school, what's a binary, they don't even know. I mean, but now it's everybody, it's in the language.
It's very used.
And I would argue this to my death, that the word binary and non-binary and all this kind of stuff that we see very, very common in our culture today is because principally Jacques Derrida. Although nobody is going to probably make that connection unless they're in tune with philosophical trends. But a guy like Jacques Derrida teaches at University of California, and he influences a bunch of students who go off and become college professors across the land. They influence students who go off and teach. Those people have children, they teach them. So there's like a genesis and a lifespan of an idea and how it works through the world. And I would argue that it begins oftentimes in small philosophical circles, and then it gets propagated through the education system, and then ultimately into, the guy's living in California. He's close to Hollywood. He's got Hollywood buddies. These people are making movies, and all of a sudden, these concepts kind of infiltrate into the common zeitgeist. Remember that word?
Oh, yeah.
The zeitgeist of the culture, and it influences it. And so, again, if you're like, oh, I don't want to study this philosophy, this stuff's too much. Well, at least you're doing what you're doing now and spend an hour a week learning about some of this stuff. It doesn't mean you have to be reading these books. In fact, I don't even want to read these books. But I do think we need to know about them. So, all right. So anyways, thank you for those comments, Buddy and Mary. Appreciate it very much. And if there's any other comments out there, I don't know that we have trivia today, do we? Or did you think of anything? You're going to try to take something up in the moment?
Give me a second here.
I will say, and don't feel any pressure. Sure. You don't have to do that. Next week, we are not going to have a Back to the Father because we are going to be on retreat in Midland. Although I think it would be so much fun to have like
on the road.
Yeah, like pull somebody from the GRN to be on Back to the Father with us. I do want to thank Joe Schuler because Joe connected me with a Thomist priest out in Washington, D.C., who Joe, at least, would like to have on this show. So we might have some guests on the show in the weeks to come. I know Marty Matulia, who is our GM in Alabama, he wanted to come on and talk about Augustine because he's a big fan of Augustine. That'd actually be kind of fun because then we wouldn't have to get frustrated by a horrible philosopher.
You're like, let's learn about one of the great philosophers.
The great ones. Please. But I mean, how many great ones are there? I would consider great Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Augustine. Beyond that,
it kind of gets a little iffy after that.
It really
super
does.
Safe. I also want to say real quick that our Back to the Father email list that goes out, we're only about 8 or 9 away from being at 100. So if you're not on our email list, I would encourage you to do that. I'll put a link down here. And by the way, Buddy says thank you for sharing your knowledge. But yeah, it'd be great if we could get up to 100 people on that list, because the more we grow, like Dave was saying, it's really important for all of us to at least put some part of our week aside to learn about these things, because it is impacting our culture and our daily life. Mm-hmm. So I just put a link in there where you can find a way to sign up from there. It'll
be so much fun. I remember back when I was younger, I would listen to these radio stations, and like every Friday afternoon, they would go to like a restaurant and be out in the patio, and they'd invite people to come and be with them. And, Friday, there's a vibe about Friday afternoons. Yeah. It's like, the weekend is starting and you're kind of chilling out. And, imagine maybe even having a beer and sitting on the patio and talking about some deep philosophy.
Welcome to our patio.
That's what the philosophers
that's what we should
used to do.
To build our set to look like, Dave, is to look like a patio.
Like a patio.
Have a glass of iced tea. Or whiskey, whatever you want to do. Either way, I like both. Real quick, I like
that binary.
Thank you. Thank you.
Iced tea and whiskey.
Those are the only 2 options you have. Really quickly, I have 3 questions about Memorial Day, since we're going to Memorial Day.
Okay. Yeah, good idea.
So, do you know what Memorial Day was originally known as? It was not always called Memorial Day.
Remembrance Day.
Not quite. No.
Let's see. Thanksgiving Day. No, well, I think that's kind of taken, isn't it? I have no idea.
Decoration Day.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
So you decorated your house?
No, I think it's because you're decorating the graves of those who have fallen.
Okay.
That's my understanding anyway. In what year did Memorial Day become an official annual holiday?
1946.
1946. I love you were very on that.
I know.
1868. Close enough.
Oh, 1868. Yeah. Really? Do you know why I would have said 1946?
Because of the World War II ending.
Yeah. Right. Well, World War II ended in 45.
Yep. Well, wait, what year does the Civil War end?
Civil War was 1861 to 65.
So then it was a few years after that.
Okay.
Last
took
one.
Them a while.
What flower will typically be worn on this holiday in remembrance for fallen soldiers?
Okay. I'm going to say, that's a great question. I don't think it's a rose.
It's really popular, I think, especially in England, for them to wear this remembrance of soldiers. It's a pretty common.
Oh, really?
Thing. I had not really heard that it was a thing in America, but
I don't know, tulip.
A red poppy.
A poppy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, a red poppy.
Yep. All right.
I would have thought white, but
it would make sense.
Maybe for blood or for maybe those who died or something like that.
I have absolutely no idea on that end. But yeah, there you go. There's your trivia.
You don't guarantee the explanation, just the question.
I do not.
The question, the answer.
I'll leave you with more questions and more confusion. Sorry, maybe I am like Derrida.
Right, like Derrida. Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your Friday. Thank you for joining us on the Back to the Father program. Thank you for your support of the Guadalupe Radio Network. We are going on retreat next week. We won't have a Friday show, but the following week we will be back. And I'm debating between Kant and Hegel. Kant and Hegel, okay? You can email us and put in your vote, backtothefather@grnonline.com. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for Back to the Father. And don't forget, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. If you have comments about the show, email